Hello and welcome to the Catholic Art Institute podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Matthew Connor, who is a Catholic artist. Matthew was raised in a devout home in the woods of Tennessee, and by the grace of God, he was received into the Catholic Church during graduate school. He studied art at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and the New York Academy. After nearly a decade of being a matte painter, he returned to the South and started creating sacred art for parishes and private homes. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matthew.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm very interested in discussing your work, which seems to be a beautiful and unique blending of the iconographic and Gothic periods. It's clear you were inspired by the writing of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, whose work in the spirit of the liturgy reflects on the three major schools of sacred art, the iconographic, the Gothic, and the Baroque. And each uses a different mode of approaching the transcendent eschatology, eschatological reality for the former, incarnational particulars for the latter, and conjoining of the two in the Gothic and early Renaissance, Plato and Aristotle's idea of hyliomorphic concepts. This and other commentaries on the faith and sacred art have very clearly informed your work. But before we dive into all the specifics, I was wondering if we could lay some groundwork, um, including your conversion story and artistic training. So you mentioned in your biography that your conversion took place in graduate school. Could you please tell us about your upbringing and faith journey?
Um, sure. My parents are very committed Christians, and they really raised us in a local church here that was, you know, it was in many ways I'm very grateful for. It really inspired a love for our Lord and for Scripture, and like you said, it did lay foundations. I think as I got older, I was a little less comfortable with certain maybe theological or just cultural issues with it. So I think by the time I was ready to leave and go off for graduate school, I was kind of just time to look. I just wasn't able to kind of do it anymore. So I was starting to kind of just float around for a while, and then started learning about church history a little bit, and maybe where all the different denominations came from, and that whole kind of situation. So eventually I had a roommate who was going to an Episcopal church, so I went to an Episcopal church, and that was like the first time of being anywhere near a liturgical church, which that was, they had a form of liturgy, and I remember hearing them reference St. Augustine in the homily that day on the first day. And it was kind of like both of those things were like miles beyond anything I'd ever experienced in a church. So, that was definitely the road that started it. So,
And your art has probably also played a role, I'd imagine. So you have training from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and then the New York Academy of Art. What were the differences in philosophy and training you encountered there?
um, so the University of Tennessee is just I would imagine is a pretty standard kind of just postmodern education. So you're kind of just getting a smattering of kind of, or well, not smattering, but you're getting kind of like a broad array of like introduction to technical and studio issues. I mean, techniques sort of, and then a lot of theory and philosophy and psychology and that whole kind of. I think you're familiar with what I've heard previously. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, Kandinsky's book is usually on the top of that pile. And yeah, and sometimes the training can be a little all over the place, I think, depending on where you go. So it seems to me like you were drawn to the New York Academy because there's clearly a little more of an atelier approach there, I think, just fine-tuning the techniques.
mm-hmm.
How did you find that experience?
Well, as far as the school, I was very happy with it. I mean, I kind of realized when I got out of graduate or undergraduate school that it'd been valuable. It wasn't. I felt like I was exposed to a lot, which wasn't bad, and not in a bad way,
Right.
you know. But I realized when I got done that it's like I didn't really know how to paint. So it's kind of like, in a sense, it's like, so I had been hearing about ateliers towards the end of school, and I think I read you went to the Water Street for a while.
I studied with people at the Water Street, but I wasn't actually there. And then I studied with Robert Liberace, but it was a similar thing where it was clear to me that I had natural ability, but I could only get so far with it. And when I saw what was happening in that movement, I just sought out as best as I could. And boy, did it make a huge difference, just the process, which I know has helped when you try to draw and paint out of your imagination, that long study from life and the process of approaching making a finished painting was so helpful. I mean, it was a revelation to me, and that's why I like to share about it, because it really puts the skills into the artist's hands to have the real freedom that they need, to express themselves. It's better to have more tools than less. So that's so you were there at the New York Academy, and then you had this conversion experience, which obviously began prior to that. But was this the beauty and the art, and probably studying church history and then church art? That must have been a little bit of a confluence there, was it?
It was. I may have been slightly mistaken. I don't think I actually was received into the church until a couple years after graduate school, but it was still part of while I was in New York and that whole kind of period. Yeah, I mean, it's funny when I was at some point when I was either seriously considering entering the church or if I was in RCA, I can't remember at that point, but it's like looking back at art history through the church, it started, not that I know a lot of it, but it started making so much more sense. It's like, when I was a Protestant looking at art history, much less even secular or not, it's like you see a Michelangelo or you find Caravaggio or something. It's kind of like, they have some painting from scripture. It's kind of like, well, it's kind of just a nice idea. I guess it's what you would put in a church, I guess. But it's like, oh, that crucifix is going right over the altar or right over the tabernacle, and that symbolism of or not the symbolism, but just the direct iconographic link between that and the Holy Sacrifice and everything, fresco cycles that are teaching different, they're basically catechism, having all of that in the church, it all just kind of made more sense why things went where they went and why you were doing things like that. So
Right. And in our conversations before we recorded this, it was clear to me that you have done an awful lot of research and reading. So, I'm going to put in the show notes a nice bibliography of some of the things that you were exploring. So I'm sure that process must have started during this time period where you were reading thoughts of people from tradition and Cardinal Ratzinger. I mean, is that?
it's just, growing up, for all the good things, it's like if we heard about anybody who was maybe more than a generation of older, it was like 1930s was kind of like the cutoff of kind of the church experience. It's kind of like, well, surely there were people that loved our Lord before that. So it's like, what was going on for 1900 years? So starting to read and finding St. Thomas, finding Justin Martyr, just reading around these kind of things, just some of the clarity and some of the historicity, and then even as you talk about some of the beauty. I remember hearing a recording of Hildegard von Bingen's, I think it was her propers for the feast of St. Ursula and the, what was it, 10,000 or 11,000 martyrs with me. It's just like, I think that was kind of like one of the last clinchers. It's kind of like, it was just so beautiful. It's kind of like, if that's what's fostering this, then it's kind of like there's just
Yeah, there's the truth that's behind it. Mm, yeah, that's so interesting. And so you received your degree and all of that training, which I'm sure put a lot of tools in your hand, and you became a matte painter. Could you talk about that, and then maybe eventually how that practice may have informed your present work?
Sure. So visual effects or post-production for film, I mean, I kind of get the impression most people are fairly familiar with it now with, green screens and blue screens and what have you. I don't know if maybe you're doing more of that now as well. So
I personally am not, but you were painting these things, hand painting them, and they were being put into film. Is that? I'm sorry, just for the audience or anybody, I'm not
yeah.
as familiar.
So it's all on the computer now. So it's most of the painting work is done in Photoshop, and then there's other
Mm.
proprietary software for the putting the things together, the compositing aspect of it. So, um, I finished up at the academy and was needing work and wasn't sure what was going to happen. And after a couple months, very providentially, one of my friends was working at a really small visual effects company there in New York. There's a lot of visual effects companies in New York,
Yeah.
that and the West Coast. But they needed matte painters, so they were willing to take somebody who didn't really have any idea what they were doing and who could paint a little bit. So I was very fortunate. They were very, very gracious, and I learned from all the people around me on the floor for like, I don't know, I ended up being there 10 years, 11 years, something like that. So it was just, there was difficulties as well, but it was a very good time. I learned a lot and worked with very good people. And
Yeah. No, I mean, a practice like that where you're able to use your artistic gifts. Well, first of all, I mean, I did that out of school doing hand-drawn illustrations, but then
oh, really?
I learned how to do, illustration in Photoshop and Illustrator, and that was really helpful. So I was always grateful for being able to kind of draw for a living, sometimes directly, but then other times, and that did, they're helpful skills, and it certainly informed my work the more I carried on. Just that process of working between your imagination to render something, realistic. That's so interesting. But
Yeah, I
then,
didn't realize. I'm sorry.
oh, no, no, go on.
Yeah, I didn't realize you had done illustration work till just recently. I was looking back through your portfolio and whatnot online. It's like, oh, okay. I wasn't. I know your paintings, but I don't know the breadth of everything you do. So
Well, some of it is sort of older. I mean, it is. I have a lot of the things that I do have. They're more digital, So I don't. It's not the work that I think is the most interesting that I've done, but I have done. I have done it. It is great to be able to get out of school with a painting degree and be able to draw for a living. And I have been able to do that on and off. Anyway, um, I just know that all those roads have led to, the skills that I have, and it's all been very helpful. Sometimes even when you're wondering why you're working in the secular world doing something when your heart is with sacred art. But so now you are committed and able to do that, which is amazing, and your work is amazing. So I want to kind of dive into your work because, as I said in the intro, I really see one of the quotes that you sent me was from Cardinal Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, about his discussions in that book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, about the iconographic, Gothic, and Baroque styles and why those are the most appropriate, and how you've really fused in a modern way, but I mean, you're a contemporary artist who seems to be advancing from those traditions in a unique and really amazing way. It's beautiful. So, um, maybe you could just share a little bit about your approach to that. I mean, obviously, there's the reading, there's looking at art, and then I just was interested in just the entire process, the materials. Do you start with a detailed drawing? Do you use models? that kind of thing. Maybe you could just talk about your process.
Yeah, I think I first I heard about Pope Benedict's that part of the Spirit of the Liturgy in a book by David Clayton, I believe it was. And he draws out what's in the Spirit of the Liturgy a little bit. He develops it a little bit more, but I don't know. It just having those three kind of modalities, and kind of there's sort of a linear kind of more eschatological, more kind of imminent, and then kind of like a tertium quid almost. But it seemed a very clear way of kind of approaching the subject of sacred art, and kind of why there was differences, but maybe also why there were those three different methodologies were still useful. It also kind of maybe helped, having a little bit more clarity helped me kind of re-examine things a bit more. So, the Baroque or the neo-academic, or that whole kind of the very perceptually realistic kind of school, that I feel like is a little bit, it seems a little bit more clear and a little bit easier to understand, and is, I think, probably pretty well appreciated. I mean, there is a certain, like discovering Caravaggio and just kind of like that kind of pathos and that kind of reality of like being able to like, see our Lord grabbing St. Thomas's hand and like putting it in his side. It's just, that on one hand, was easier to grasp. And then learning more about the iconographic tradition, you see that kind of rich, I think, what they call maybe like the canonicity of it, where it's kind of like it's preserving kind of almost in a visual form that kind of the integrity of the faith. And then the Gothic kind of being in this kind of interesting place in between. So you still, especially the earlier, still like the late Gothic and the early Renaissance, you're still dealing with those that same kind of integrity of actually like the content of what goes into any said painting on any subject. It's not just kind of a completely individualistic enterprise, but there is that movement towards like greater naturalism and like a little bit more diversification. It just seems like a very kind of rich place to, if that's what someone feels drawn towards, but it seems like a very rich field or modality.
Yeah.
I started hearing about and reading a lot of someone I know, I think has worked with you before, Daniel Mitsui. He writes a lot and is very, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to his work and like read through his bibliography of who he's referencing, and like maybe I should go read, see what they're doing. And so.
Yeah, because he's doing a similar thing in working in time-honored traditions, but making them sort of unique to this day. And I think you put your finger on it, with the Gothic. I think there's a reason why it's so very powerful. I was very moved when I was studying this in college, and I didn't really have a deep grasp of the faith as I do now, but there was something that just transcended that and was so deeply touching and moving. And it was that balance of the idealization. I mean, Dennis McNamara talks about this and several other people, that it's not so realistic that the sense of the sacred is lost. And I think that sometimes, while I love the atelier training, we need to walk back a little from that when it comes to dealing with sacred art sometimes, that it can be a little problematic and over naturalization of something that should be revealing the divine life. And anyway, this is what I see that you do so profoundly in your work. So it's so interesting that you've managed to fuse this and bring it into today. And maybe we could just talk about some specific examples, because your work is really rich and layered. It's clear that symbolism plays a part. And as I said, Dennis has talked extensively about this. So we could start with your painting called Mundus Inversus. which is a really curious example. Could you explain the subject matter, which includes a monkey gazing into a mirror framed by a ring of daffodils? What inspired this, and could you just talk about it a little bit more?
Sure. I think the imagery is drawing on, a lot of marginalia from manuscript to manuscript tradition. Oftentimes which can be rather playful at first, or kind of, silly, even sometimes even absurdly silly, maybe
Right.
inappropriately. But there's a long tradition going back to Physiologus, reading of using animals symbolically, or like drawing out maybe how they appear in scripture, or um, even especially simians. Being kind of stand-ins for kind of us humans and kind of our tendency towards vanity in this case, or they tend to be kind of lighthearted ways of looking at ourselves and kind of reminding us of things. So there's some images of monkeys usually looking at themselves in mirrors, referencing vanity and just being a little bit overly concerned with natural things.
Yeah. And the daffodils, is there a symbolism there that's used in
Yeah,
tradition?
I think it's the Greek name for them. Well, I don't know if it's transfers into Latin. For daffodils is Narcissus, so that's referencing.
Okay, right.
Yeah,
Yeah. I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I know my symbolism, but sometimes I've got to look it up and I just didn't have it at my fingertips. But it's beautifully done and it certainly gets the point across. And I love the reference to the manuscripts. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of the articles about the rabbits, and
mm-hmm.
the rabbits are roasting the monks because the monks lived on the rabbit. There is a lot of like playfulness that can happen on those margins, which are I just so fascinating. I just think it's wonderful that you've been inspired by that. You have another piece called Mortum
Okay.
Cartidae, which is sort of like a memento mori painting, but means daily death. So I think this is another sort of dying to oneself. Could you talk about this painting?
Sure. So it is sort of operating in the memento mori kind of tradition, but as you point out, I apologize, I forget the longer um, text reference on there, but that's actually coming from one of the the instruments of good works from Saint Benedict's rule. So it operates sort of in two directions. One is more the standard memento mori kind of idea of, remember you're going to die, so, order your life accordingly. Don't get overly, put things in their proper places, and don't be overly invested in inappropriate things.
And then around the frame, you have flowers and a leaf motif.
Mhm.
And is there a specific flower that this is referencing, or is this more a decorative aspect, or what is, let's talk about that a little bit.
I think it's a little more the overall just conceptual tonality, I guess, if you want. You've probably seen a lot of there's some requiem vestments. I want to say more from like the 17th through like the 19th century, that they have like a conjoining of like very macabre kind of skulls and skeletal things, very obviously dealing with death, but then also like very very floral elements at the same time put together. So you
Yeah,
kind of have the idea of, you know, death, but also, and the death of the flowers, but also the rebirth that the flowers are kind of symbolizing, and kind of a.
right. Yeah, that's great. I've seen some of those older vestments. Some of them are just incredible. breathtaking, especially for the Requiem Mass at the end of the year. So in doing you work in acrylic, is that correct?
I've
Or
been working.
tempera?
I've been working mostly in acrylic. I've been starting to get back into. I've been dabbling in some tempera again. So,
Yeah.
are you
Well,
mostly oil, or what do you? What all?
yeah,
What is the gamut?
of course I've used acrylic. I just got used to using the oil. It suits my temperament, and I feel like I have more control over layering with it. But I haven't. I want to revisit some of my work because this organization takes a lot of time from me. But when it comes to, I've learned a lot in doing this organization and my own reading too. So I don't know that I'd work in acrylic, but I want to try to walk backward a little bit from my more atelier style training and kind of some of the Baroque things that I've tried to do, and perhaps work a little more in the Gothic period, because it's always something like Jan van Eyck in particular has always been an inspiration, and
Yeah.
Botticelli too. They're just two artists that I just love, and I kind of want to have my hand at seeing what happens when I try to work in that vein. So do you start with a drawing here? I mean, do you just use your imagination or maybe some photos, or I don't know, how do you work?
It's a rather terrible mess, I must say.
Well, if it gets you here, then you're doing something right. So,
it's it's not terribly linear. I mean, one of the beautiful things about like the atelier and the classical training is that was, I think, as you were talking about, gives you like tools earlier. It's like it's it was kind of a revelation. It's kind of like, oh, you don't just kind of have to like kind of just keep smashing away. It's like, no, first you learn how to draw, then you can put the drawing down so you get proportions and things right. Don't worry about value, don't worry about color, just get the drawing right, and then get the value right, and then get the color right. And very makes things more incremental, and it's easier to kind of deal with deal with certain issues at certain stages instead of just trying to like figure everything out at once.
yeah.
As it, all the Prima is wonderful by people who really know what they're doing. It's great, but it's hard to start there. So,
Yeah.
how,
And so often
are
you're kind of forced to start there. I mean, that was sort of my experience in conventional art college. It was like, here's your stuff. Now paint that thing in front of you. And you're like, whoa, is that how, so you think Michelangelo just fell out of the sky with so much more talent? I mean, arguably, yeah, but like there was a process that brought him, to that level. But um, anyway, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Well, I'll ask you more about your process first, then I'll get back to your question. I mean, how do you have you typically in your more mature work? Have you been working? Do you start with like a deadpan or a verdaccio or?
Um, a detailed drawing, which helps me, and then usually like an umber grisaille,
Okay.
and then just layer upon layer of just correcting that drawing with the paint. It's just that's the way I need to work, because I will lose my way if I don't. And I sketch out beforehand, and sometimes I composite things in Photoshop. I know people that work like this just because it's faster and easier sometimes to move things around to get, it's like I start with a conception of something, but then if I have to work from photography, there's a transformation that happens. I don't just try to rotely copy something. I'm not interested in making something simply like a photograph, because why not we just have the photograph? What's the point of that? I don't see it. And you lose the painterliness, and I can't say that sometimes my work hasn't gotten awfully tight, it's very finished down, and sometimes I wonder if it's lost some of its life. But these are all things that I think we as artists, but I love the layering, so kind of that older technique of color over either a grisaille or an umber painting grisaille, and then just correcting and layers of thin layers. This is where you get sort of this beautiful glow in your skin tones. But if I had work from life, I would, there's no way that I could look at a photograph and transform it because I wouldn't, a photograph just does all kinds of weird stuff because it's mechanical. It compresses color. Oftentimes you can get real weirdness happening with foreshortening. And if you don't understand your anatomy and how to describe forms, it's really hard to correct that. You're just stuck trying to use this flat photograph and it's not ideal. But then, yes, I've had models. Sometimes I need a hand, I need some drape, work from life that way. I mean, I've just cobbled this stuff together, frankly. Like,
No.
just getting it done. And it was like, well, these are the tools I have at hand. This is what I can, pull together myself from all of this various, experience I've had. So anyway, I'm sorry. But does that clarify? I mean, do you work?
I work probably very similarly, just maybe methodology a little differently. I mean, I don't usually make a final, like a finished drawing beforehand. Not, I do appreciate that. Maybe just I do it a little bit more in like segments. If there's like an area that I really need to I realize I'm weak on, I need to kind of like invest some time looking at the form or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's things that I don't. I mean, it's like I'm not that crazy because it is kind of crazy. It's like I'm not going to make a whole finished drawing and have to paint over it, but yeah, it's like particularly when there's hands and features and things like that, it's like I just feel like I'm going to lose that and then, I'm careful with the underpainting and then over it in the layers. And it will always go through this ugly period where it's like I feel like I'm losing, I call it the ugly adolescence of the painting. It's like it just does. It gets rough, and then it's like I got to correct the drawing a bit, and you feel like you're fighting with it a little bit. But then when you turn that corner, it's like, what a great thing to see something kind of coming to life right before your eyes. And anyway, that's
Yeah,
my.
I wish I could find it again. I was reading an iconographer, and he was talking about that kind of that common trajectory that one experiences in the studio, kind of at the beginning, and just like seeing all the possibilities and just being like carried away about how great this is going to be, and then then you hit the, I forget his word language, kind of like the aesthetical point where it's just kind of like this and I are a great failure and this is never going to end, and then it's kind of just like by the grace of God something comes out of that you didn't expect, and you're just kind of like, this is all you're doing, and it's wonderful in our sight, and it's kind of like, this is just I'm just going to sit here now. That's all I've got to say.
Right. No, I mean, and I have artist friends, and I think we all go through this where you feel like you're just wrestling with that, and because I have a vision in my mind of what it is I'm trying to do, and okay, well, the eye is painted soundly, but is it communicating the emotion that I was hoping it would? And that's where my faith, I would say, really helped me walk over that bridge of not being afraid to keep going, to correct and not, not not lose the courage to fight to get it to what it is at the end of it and not just settle for something because I'm too afraid to touch it. So the faith has definitely helped me with that. I love your depiction of Saint Joseph. So you have chosen to depict him in the more Counter-Reformation style as a young carpenter holding the child Jesus. Um, and he appears to be building a Gothic church, and you've cleverly added Our Lady as a stone carving in the facade. But the church isn't completed, and outside of it is this bucolic scene. And there's the flight to Egypt that's on the right-hand side. It's just very fascinating layers of work. Could you just talk about all, your decisions there and your conception for it? I love this painting.
Well, thank you. So the pastor who was commissioning it, he was wanting, he and his congregation had devotion to Saint Joseph. This is actually before this year was announced. Very interestingly.
Hmm.
So they wanted to almost make like ex voto painting just to say thank you. And specifically in, as you well observed, more in the Counter-Reformation tradition. So if maybe viewers aren't as familiar, there's the older tradition of depicting Saint Joseph is usually as an older man, for various reasons. But then I think was it Saint Catherine of Siena that was really kind of one of the big proponents for a younger Joseph. I forget.
Yeah, and Fulton Sheen also talked about this, that he is a model of the priesthood, and that he, the chastity that he sacrificed, in addition to leading the family and being a father figure, that that's there's good reasons for both, but that I like that because I did a painting of Saint Joseph. I love Saint Joseph. I have a devotion, and I chose the more younger approach to it. But I did mine very simply in his staff of lilies. I loved that story of the betrothal. But you have a carpet here, and talk about this. And the doorway is still unfinished. It's really interesting.
So some of his father Ryan Jerebeck actually, his kind of main interests were Saint Joseph as a younger, more vigorous man, kind of as particularly as a role model for some of the men in the community. And maybe aesthetically, he was drawn towards the Northern Renaissance, just for that kind of wonderful kind of richness of visual richness, but then also symbolic reference, just something that could sustain prolonged time within the painting. So we were able to kind of, through some research, looked into what is his name? I think he was a bishop or cardinal Molinus. Anyways, it's just some of the symbolism to tie in. So the idea was Saint Joseph, obviously in this, in life on Earth, being a carpenter or a stonemason, depending, but also in protector of the Holy Family, but also kind of protector of the whole universal church. So kind of like crossing those together, showing him kind of like actually building the church and kind of protecting it, looking after it. The Holy Family, as you pointed out, kind of escaping to Egypt on the one side. Again, Saint Joseph, just like Our Lady, is kind of his relationship with the rest of the Holy Family is kind of maybe one of the major things of his life. So it seemed important to try to draw them into the painting as well. So as you point out, there's the fairly common statue of Our Lady right over the portal with Christ. And then on either side, there's the frieze on either side of her has Saint Joseph the Patriarch, where he's on one side turning away from Potiphar's wife, so referencing the chastity that both Josephs exhibited, and then on the other side where he's helping count the grain that's coming in, that's going to preserve all of Egypt and the surrounding countries from the famine. So, both Joseph's kind of material provision for their family or the communities they're overseeing. There's some reference, like in the flowers, as you point out, the lilies, which were so important to Saint Joseph, also have reference for Our Lady and the kind of the purity. The violets, which are more for Our Lady, and irises. There may be violets in there as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful and thoughtfully done, and I love how you've included all of these layers into that story. It's a great painting. I'm so glad to hear about it.
Because obviously, just from I can, symbolism is all something you think about and I wonder sometimes, like, there can be there can be a danger sometimes, I think, with maybe certain applications of symbolism where it almost becomes like a coded game, kind of like whether or not you're on the inside or the outside, whether you understand or not, or as opposed to kind of like making something that enriches the experience. I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
quite. How have you dealt with that?
How have I dealt with it? Well, I haven't done things that are quite this complex. I mean, I certainly employed the symbolism of purity in the lilies for Saint Joseph. I mean, I just didn't layer in so many other things. But yeah, I mean, colors and some of these things are well known, and and Dennis again talks about this in the church design, why they're there, and so I think to the extent that most people can read them, most people kind of can. If not, they can easily explore and find out why. But I think it's a good teaching tool, and a lot of time it wasn't obvious to me when I was in art college.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can recognize statues of saints, and they have a palm frond, so I know they're a martyr, and then they have their instruments. It wasn't always clear to me that these things were not just incidental things. Oh, well, the artist just thought this was interesting, or maybe there was some story there. It just was never taught. There's nobody that's looking at these time periods in art and pulling these details out, which always just adds so much more than just something that's visually engaging like you've done here, because this is visually engaging. It's all these beautiful details with the Gothic cathedral and the flowers and just the stuff that all we artists love to paint, but there's reasons for them to be there, and that's kind of what I was trying to draw out. Is it's great, it's very smart, and it's just a teaching tool. So I don't know, I just wanted to talk about it. I think you just did a really thoughtful job. So um, where are we? Okay. Um, if I didn't mention, congratulations for your honorable mention and finalists in the Sacred Art Prize. I neglected to mention that because I wanted to talk about your Vesperbild painting, which is a breathtaking depiction of the Pietà, as it's called in Italian. Could you discuss just the title, concept, any symbolism in this piece?
Sure. Yeah, I was very honored to have a piece chosen for the show. I mean, having Dr. McNamara being the one curating it was obviously very piqued one's interest anyways, just hearing about it, and then seeing the actual work that was submitted and picked for it was very encouraging. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
sometimes there's a broad range of work that kind of is shown. All this work was very high quality, so it was very nice to see all of it.
Yeah, we both felt that way. It was good to see really what's going on out there, because sometimes people like yourself are working more quietly, and this kind of work should be showcased. So it wasn't just this one piece, which was an honorable mention. You had several selected, so, and rightly so. So talk about the title, Vesperbild.
I wasn't able to find a whole lot written on it. The short answer is it's basically a Northern European kind of version of the Pietà. If I remember correctly, I wanted to say it tends to be sculpted. I don't think there's as many painted references for it, but more knowledgeable people could correct me. So I think probably it was just the language thing, and there's a slightly different flavor to them. I mean, they're a little bit more. They tend to flourish more in like the kind of late Gothic, International Gothic kind of period. So they're a little more kind of. They tend to be more kind of physically exaggerated in certain kind of ways, but less. I don't know. I think Pietà and I think Michelangelo's, which are great, but there's a whole different kind of compositional sense that those tended towards. That I think.
It's a good point.
Mr. Visco's talked about a lot about those kind of different modalities of like spiral versus I forget that he's talking.
Yeah, the canons of composition. That's his talk. I can put a link in that. Anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'm going to put a lot of things in the show notes, particularly your bibliography and other links, to your website and stuff. But and I see you've done it again with this northern sort of approach, the Gothic approach, but then the flattened halos, which is kind of more coming from the iconographic style, and the compressed palette, which does so well to frame this moving scene. Um, and then you've chosen to put the crown of thorns on the ground. I mean, any reason for that, or
I think. Well, maybe I'll work backwards. I can't exactly remember why I put the crown of thorns on the ground at this point. I think I forget if it was just content-wise, if it just felt like it needed something else. I can't remember exactly what it was now, but it seemed. I think I probably also had been looking at, or had seen at some point, just some of the just various parts of like the Arma Christi, and kind of like the idea of like even the sacredness of like angels carrying like the cross or like the lance or something, even those or even like the gospel books by like the evangelists or whatnot. It's like even those in the older depictions, they're always carrying those like with veils. They're not touching them directly, or
yeah,
even like altar servers, if they're not consecrated, touch like the holy chalice or something like that, using like something. So just that, I think that kind of visual motif kind of tied in with the moment of what was going on there between the deposition and the entombment.
yeah. Well, it works compositionally too. It's yeah, very smartly done. I love it. Um, I want to talk next about your painting of Saint Raphael, Arness Baron, um, which is another fine example which borrows from the Gothic with that exaggerated perspective, ornate floor, and then the view to the outside world, which is, in this case, appears to be a desolate winter landscape. Could you tell us a little more about the saint and share a bit about the narrative and symbolism going on in this painting?
Um, you know, I don't know, maybe this is everybody's experience or not, or it's like, you know, just kind of like constantly like discovering like symbolism or saints or just the various components of like life in the church that just didn't know existed. So I found a short article, a translation from his diary online. A couple people have published English versions I could find, but anyway, so he was a Spanish, I want to say Trappist. He could have been. I'm pretty sure he's Trappist, not Cistercian general, but living in Spain just before World War II, I believe, and he died very young of, I think it was tuberculosis. I want to say, or no, it may have been maybe something like diabetes. I forget. But he actually wasn't able to profess formal vows, I think, because of some medical reasons. So he ended up being a claustral oblate, I believe. But anyways, but there's this one part from his diary where I forget what it's called. It's one of the more well-known passages of his life where he's kind of just really getting crushed by despondency. It's he's in the kitchen, he's working, it's silent, obviously. He's cold, it's winter, there's no heating, his hands are cold, it's gray and stormy outside. He's kind of just, he's talking about all these like thoughts that are just kind of like crushing him. It's like, why in the world am I doing this? This makes absolutely no sense to be here, to be doing. It's like, why don't you just go home? And, he just gets that one small little turn of thought in his mind from the Holy Spirit that says, why are you doing this? You're doing this for the love of Christ. And it's kind of like, that makes it worthwhile for him. It's kind of like, it doesn't matter if I understand. It doesn't matter if there's any great material kind of ends to it. It's kind of like, this is what he's given me to do and that I can do, so I'm going to be happy and I can give it back to him. So,
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it speaks to, I think everybody can relate to sometimes the puzzlingness of suffering, and even how something so humble is something God will use for his greater glory, and that we all have a purpose, and even in the midst of this suffering we're closer to him. I just thought it was really moving, and I love that story. I think, I think you did a very good job making that into a reality, that snapshot. And it's very, like, it's so important to do research. It's one thing I didn't mention about my work, or anytime I was ever tasked with anything. It's like, what's been done, and who are, what are all the particulars here? And sometimes that's just so helpful in visualizing something. You get a scene, and you clearly did in your imagination of what this man was going through. Anyway, beautifully done. It's just interesting, curious, and it just does so well to advance on the Gothic. I really like your work.
I just, like on that one, you've probably seen I can't think of the ones exactly, but I can see mental amalgamations of them. Like the kind of the bas relief sculptures of various scenes, and they tend to be interiors, and say the floor gets tilted up and you get those kind of compressed spaces, but it's kind of like, it's fine, it's okay. It's not like everything has to be like rendered exactly as the camera sees it, otherwise it's not valid. It's kind of like,
I think it makes it, I think, yeah, but it makes it apparently, and frankly sometimes a little more interesting because it's that way. After you look at so much art like I have, I don't want to see any more paintings that look exactly like a photograph, frankly. Like, I love the fact that there's like a realism, but kind of not. There's just something that makes it a little more interesting. Van Eyck's work especially is along those lines. Well, I wanted to just, there's so many things that we could discuss, but we can kind of close with your work on the Last Judgment triptych that you created. Just take us through all the saints depicted, and any symbolism. You have a group of saints on the left and the right. I love your depiction of the fires of hell. It's really interesting painting. How did this come about? Was this a commission, and anything you can share about it?
So this one was not a commission. It started out, as with so many things, I realized it's getting like into, getting ready for Advent, and I'm like completely behind. It's like, oh, why not make a painting on like the four last things? It's like, that's a good idea. I'm going to be 6 months too late, but next year, so.
It's a good.
So there was. Sorry.
I said it's a good point. What a nice inspiration. So I'm sorry. Go on.
Okay. So there was a standalone for the first one, which is the remembrance of death and dying. But then these three, they just got tied together. Heaven, hell, and the Last Judgment, or reordered anyways. Which, as you probably know, there's so many directions you can take that in. It's like you can do a fairly compact, which this ended up being, or you can do like the great, I get them backwards, is it Von Baden, that has like the giant one with like all of heaven and like hell, and it's just all the saints in heaven, and it's like, it's amazing, but it's just like, there's too much to try to.
Yeah. Van der Weyden, even some, like, there's one in New York City that Van Eyck did. Have you ever seen that vision of hell? But it's not large. It's a small vision of like the judgment.
Okay.
But it's really fascinating, because there's sort of this skull that looks almost like a bat, and then underneath it, it's like all of the damned falling, and you know what he can be like with some of his work. And that one in particular, it almost touches like a a Bosch or something where there's some creativity there, and you get this like
Mhm.
incredible imagination, and all of it is just really moving. Anyway, I'm sorry. Just so, who are the saints on the left? Um,
They are, if I'm remembering correctly. So obviously there's an angel bearing the instruments of the Passion at the top. Then the rear row, starting from the left, I believe there's Saint Mary Magdalene, and then there's Saint Francesca of Rome. Then there's
is it Benedict? Long white beard.
it's Anthony, I believe. Does he have the tau on his?
Yes. Okay.
Is Saint Martin de Porres? Is he next?
Yes, he's next. Yep.
Okay, and then in the row in front is from the left is Saint Mary Alacoque,
Margaret Mary Alacoque. Yeah, with the Sacred Heart. Yep.
and goodness, I just looked at these. Saint Peter's not next, I don't believe. Can you remind me who's next?
It is. Yeah, Saint Peter because he's got the keys.
Okay, it's Saint Peter, and then it's Saint Catherine, and then it's Saint Lawrence with the grill.
With the grill. Yeah. And then you have Christ in the middle and the world on top of the globe. And then you have the lilies for purity, but there's a sword.
Mm-hmm.
And St. John the Baptist, of course.
Yeah.
And then this curious scene on the right of obviously it's hell, the damned. I mean, there's a demon.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, it looks like kings and clergy.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that we're trying to approach, it's like, how do you make the terribleness of hell kind of real, but without kind of turning into like sensationalism?
Yeah.
The same thing with like the resurrection. It's like, well, having people, do you have the new body for the resurrected souls? That theologically makes sense and is completely valid, but then there's also, there's lots of questions anyways. There are different ways you can kind of go with things. For those that are going to hell, I think we were looking at I forget if it was Notre Dame or if it was Chartres. It was some of the earlier Gothic Last Judgment tympanum, and they would show kind of like a group of people like this, like chained together, and they tended to be in a certain kind of way similar as the saints on the other side, kind of representative of like different states of life. So you've got the religious, you've got the lay, you've got the married and the single, you've got those who are in authority, either civil or ecclesiastical, and you've got the more, merchants, or you've got soldiers, so it's kind of like you have all classes of people. So they're, lest anyone either think they're getting it encompasses everybody on either side. So that's what we were kind of.
And I think even the added responsibility when you if you're a king, you have an awful lot of money, and have you helped the poor? Have you done what you should have in your role? And as a reminder that we're all going to have to face that particular judgment. Well, you did very well here because you're right. A depiction of hell could become something that could turn a corner into something a little sensational, as you said, or silly. And I just think you did very well here with this stylization of the fires, and it's just it all works together. It's beautifully composed and just hits that right note. So thanks for sharing about that. Well, I've taken a lot of your time, but I thought maybe we could just close with maybe any advice that you have for emerging artists, or getting commission work, or any thoughts that you might have on that.
I have two completely indirectly applicable pieces of advice. Maybe the more pragmatic. The whole idea of keeping a regular sketchbook, I think, is wonderfully important. I mean, it was kind of instilled in school at some point. It's like you know, and to put everything in there. It's like, you know, make copies from people you find interesting, or if you find a hand that you like, or kind of a pose that's awkward in an interesting way, or if you get like partial ideas or stupid ideas, just put like it all in there. It's like sooner or later, I think it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like Lectio Divina. It's like every day you know, you maybe something kind of like glows a little bit to you, you kind of put it away and try to store it, and it's like maybe you think about it 2 days later, maybe you don't, but you know, you like to have faith that over time that kind of builds a body of something, either artistically or in one's character and whatnot. So keeping a sketchbook, I think, is great. And the other is, you know, I think we have to remember to, you know, give the Lord first place in everything, even to the point of being at, you know, at seasons, to even being able to like let go of like being attached to like the studio process, you know. There's definitely points like where you've come to kind of like a level of discernment. It's kind of, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, so I'm going to be obedient to. But just always kind of be, you know, at some point we're going to die. It's like, I don't know if we'll be sculpting in heaven or not. Maybe, hopefully, it wouldn't be a bad thing. But it's like, if we have Christ, we have everything. So if we can live with that, if we can live with Him, whatever we end up doing, it'll be good. So put that first, I guess. And, you know, then if He wants you, if He gives you the training to be an artist, then He's going to give, that's because He has work for you to do. So go with that. I forget, you had, forgive me, I'm forgetting his name, at one of your conferences 2 years ago, there was an architect that you had there, and I remember at one of the, I was listening to them because you have put them all online, which is a wonderful benefit for all of us everywhere. And somebody was asking about what he does for work, or I forget how it was worded. Maybe it was more towards commissions, and he said something to the effect, it's like, whenever I'm needing work, I go tell the Lord I'm ready for more work, and He sends more work, and it's like okay.
Yeah.
I guess that's. I don't understand. I have no idea how work comes. I mean, to be honest, I'm probably not the worst natural businessman there is.
It doesn't usually go with the artistic territory. I don't like sales and that kind of stuff. I find abhorrent, and I'm a little more quiet and introverted myself. So I mean, even being on camera like this is a whole thing. But I think that's exactly the right advice, and that's a that's a good place to end. And I think it's absolutely true. You know, that prayer, discernment, ordering your life towards God, and then following the call without fear, because it's challenging, you know, having this call, especially in a world that doesn't see much value in it, you know, sometimes.
It's one thing I've really appreciated about my little exposure with the Institute is there's a proper orientation of all things. So it's like, well, certainly let's produce the best thing we can make. Let's kind of be as informed as we can. It's like everything's towards the glory of God, and everything's towards kind of the salvation and the help of the body of Christ, and even the evangelization of the world. And it's kind of that proper focus makes everything kind of fall into place. So I'm very happy that that's a kind of a major. That's very important to artists.
Yeah, thank you. I know. Well, it's the right order, and when you have these artistic gifts, it's particularly that it's for a gift is for others. You know, it's not about my own self-expression, and so, you know, I've learned a lot of these things too, coming from the postmodern philosophy that I was, you know, posed with, and then do I have this gift and it's for others, and in what way? It's for evangelization and God's greater glory. So we just want to give our best to God, and you know, yeah, I'm glad that you recognize that. I mean, we're all just trying to do just that. So God willing, this thing will continue to grow. So, but you know, thanks so much for your time and for sharing so much about your work. And I think all of this is going to be tremendously helpful for everybody that's listening. and I'll just really look forward to seeing what you produce next. So,
Thank you for
all
having
right.
me.
All right. Well, thanks again. And hopefully we can maybe get you back on in the future. So, okay. Signing off now. Bye bye.
Take care.